Welcome back. If you have ever stood in a quiet room and listened to a grandfather clock tick, really listened, you know there is something almost alive about it. Steady, patient, like it is keeping a secret it has been holding for years. Tonight's story is about exactly that. An old man, a locked room, a clock that never stopped ticking, and last words that made no sense to anyone, except one sharp-eyed old lady sitting quietly in the corner with her knitting. This is Grandfather Clock Whispers the Truth, a Miss Marple mystery set in the kind of sleepy English village where nothing ever happens. Until it does. Stay with us. Because the answer was there all along, hidden inside the tick and the tock and the silence in between. Let's begin. A man and his clock. The village of Chipping Summerford was the sort of place that time forgot, or perhaps, more accurately, the sort of place that preferred to forget time itself. It sat quietly in the Cotswolds like an old cat on a warm windowsill, content, unhurried, and deeply suspicious of anything that moved too fast. The cottages were made of honey-colored stone. The gardens were overgrown in that particularly English way that somehow still managed to look intentional. The post office doubled as a sweet shop, and the sweet shop doubled as the primary source of village gossip, which was, by any honest measure, the true economy of Chipping Summerford. It was on a Thursday evening in late October that everything changed. Not with a bang, not with a scream, with a tick. Mr. Edmund Hargrove had lived alone in Summerford House for 11 years. Ever since his wife Clara had passed quietly in her sleep and left him with 3 guest rooms he never used, a rose garden he couldn't bring himself to tend, and a grandfather clock that he wound every Sunday morning without fail. He was 73 years old, thin in the way that old men become thin. Not frail exactly, but reduced, as though life had been slowly editing him down to his essential self. He had sharp gray eyes, a habit of tapping his fingers on the armrest when he was thinking, and an opinion on everything, which he shared with nobody unless directly asked, and sometimes even then. His neighbors respected him. His nephew visited twice a year, usually around Christmas and once in the summer, and stayed exactly as long as politeness required. The housekeeper, Mrs. Beach, came on Tuesdays and Fridays, cleaned without being asked twice, and left before noon. She was the only person who had a key to Summerford House besides Mr. Hargrove himself. That Thursday evening, Mrs. Beach was not supposed to be there, but she had forgotten her shopping bag, a small canvas thing with a yellow tulip embroidered on the side, and she had turned back from the lane, let herself in through the side door, and found him. He was in his armchair, the one by the window, the high-backed green one with the worn patches on both arms where his elbows had rested for years. The reading lamp was on. A book lay open on the side table. The History of English Gardens, page 247, face down in the way that would have made any librarian quietly despair. At first, Mrs. Beach thought he was asleep, so she picked up her bag from the kitchen, came back through the hallway and glanced into the sitting room out of simple habit, the way one does when passing a room where someone is resting. Then she saw his hand. It had slipped off the armrest and hung at an odd angle, the fingers slightly curled, and something about the stillness of it. Not the peaceful stillness of sleep, but a heavier, deeper kind, made Mrs. Beach stop breathing for a full 3 seconds. She crossed the room. She touched his shoulder. He moved, just barely. His eyes opened, gray, unfocused, trying to find her face. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm here. I'm going to ring for Dr. Pemberton right now. Do you hear me? Just stay still." His lips moved. She leaned closer, because the grandfather clock in the corner was ticking with that particular loud, self-important rhythm it always had in the evenings, and she could barely hear him. "Quarter," he said, or something like it. "What's that?" His hand moved, the one that had been hanging, and he lifted it a few inches, just enough to gesture. Not toward her, toward the clock. Not the right. He stopped. swallowed with visible effort. Hands. The hands are wrong. Mr. Hargrove, please don't try to... Eleanor. The name came out clearly. More clearly than anything else he'd said. And then, with what seemed like the last organized thought in his mind, she moved them. Ask the clock, it remembers. After that, his eyes closed, and he did not open them again. Dr. Pemberton arrived within 20 minutes. He was a sensible man, not prone to drama, and he confirmed what Mrs. Beach had already understood in her bones, that Edmund Hargrove was not going to recover. He had suffered a significant cardiac episode, and whatever time remained to him was being measured now in hours, not days. The police were called. Not because there was any obvious sign of foul play, so no, there wasn't, but because Dr. Pemberton was also a cautious man, and the bruising on Mr. Hargrove's left wrist, faint but present, troubled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate over the telephone. Constable Reed arrived, took notes, looked at the clock, looked at the wrist, and decided the matter was above his particular pay grade. He rang Inspector Graves in Cirencester. Inspector Graves arrived at 9:30, by which point a small collection of neighbors had gathered at the garden gate in that instinctive way that villagers have. Not intruding exactly, but present. Witnesses to something they couldn't name yet. Inside, the grandfather clock kept ticking. Loud, patient, steady, as though it had something to say and was simply waiting for the right person to ask. The village speaks. By 10 o'clock that Thursday evening, the garden gate of Summerford House had become something of an unofficial gathering point for the better part of Chipping Summerford's more curious residents. They stood in small clusters, collars turned up against the October chill, speaking in the hushed but thoroughly detailed tones that the English reserve specifically for neighborhood disasters. Mrs. Pauline Fitch, who lived directly across the lane and had the sharpest eyes in the village, had already cycled through 3 complete theories by the time Inspector Graves' car pulled up. She was a compact, efficient woman in her early 60s, the sort who kept a notebook for household accounts and secretly used it to record the comings and goings of everyone on the street. She had seen things, as she told anyone who would listen. She had noticed things. There was someone at his door, she said to nobody in particular, and then, because nobody in particular responded satisfactorily, she said it again, louder, to Mrs. Cornish from the post office. Earlier this evening, before 6. I couldn't see the face clearly. The light was already going. But it wasn't the housekeeper. Wrong build entirely. Mrs. Cornish, who was rounder and considerably more cautious than Mrs. Fitch, pulled her cardigan tighter and said she wasn't one to speculate. This was, everyone in the village knew, entirely untrue. Inspector Graves was 44, tired, and had driven 40 minutes on dark country roads to stand in a dead man's sitting room looking at a grandfather clock that was, by all appearances, simply a grandfather clock. He had a long face, the permanent expression of a man who has heard every possible explanation for every possible situation and found most of them unconvincing, and a notebook in which he wrote things down in handwriting so small it was practically encoded. He stood in the center of the sitting room and looked at the assembled facts. One elderly man found collapsed in his chair, one book face down on the side table, one lamp burning, one clock ticking, and one set of last words that the housekeeper had written down verbatim on the back of a shopping receipt because she had nothing else to hand, and which read, in her looping careful script, quarter, not the right, hands. The hands are wrong. Eleanor, she moved them. Ask the clock. It remembers. Inspector Graves read it twice. Then he looked at the clock. Then he looked at Dr. Pemberton. Eleanor, he said. His late wife was Clara, Dr. Pemberton offered. I never treated anyone named Eleanor in connection with this household. Nephew's name? Geoffrey. Geoffrey Hargrove. He's been telephoned. He's driving up from Bristol, should arrive by midnight. Graves made a note. Anyone else with regular access to the house? Mrs. Beach, the housekeeper. And I understand Mr. Hargrove had a solicitor who visited occasionally. Fellow named Ashworth, from the firm in Bourton-on-the-Water. Graves wrote that down too. Then he looked at the clock again with the expression of a man who does not believe in clocks having anything useful to say, but has learned over the years to keep an open mind about it. Geoffrey Hargrove arrived at 11:47, which was, as Inspector Graves privately noted, so slightly faster than Bristol to Chipping. Summerford ought to take on a Thursday night, which meant he had either left before being telephoned or driven considerably above the speed limit. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with his uncle's grey eyes and none of his uncle's stillness. He moved quickly, spoke quickly, and had the particular energy of a man who is performing grief while also calculating something behind it. "I came as fast as I could," he said at the door, slightly breathless. "How is he? Is he—" "He's alive," Dr. Pemberton said carefully. "But I must be honest with you, Mr. Hargrove. The outlook is not good." Geoffrey pressed his lips together and nodded in a way that was meant to look like controlled emotion and landed somewhere slightly short of it. He was shown into the sitting room. He looked at the armchair where his uncle lay. They had not moved him on the doctor's advice. And then his eyes went, almost involuntarily, to the grandfather clock. It was a large piece. 7 feet tall, dark walnut, with a painted face showing a pastoral scene above the clock face itself. A country cottage, a yellow sky, small figures that had been worn almost smooth by decades of winding and looking. It had a deep, resonant tick, the kind that you stopped hearing after a few minutes and then suddenly heard again, louder than before, when the room went quiet. Geoffrey looked at it for perhaps 2 seconds longer than was natural. Graves noticed. He always noticed things like that, the small excesses and the small omissions, and he filed it away without comment. By midnight, the inspector had spoken to 5 people, but he did this methodically, in the dining room, one at a time, with Constable Reed sitting quietly in the corner, pretending to be furniture. Mrs. Beach, the housekeeper, was 61, steady and precise. She had arrived at Summerford House at approximately 7:30 to retrieve her forgotten bag. She had her own key. She had found Mr. Hargrove at 7:34. She was certain of the time because she had checked her watch when she came through the gate, as she always did, a habit left over from years of catching the Cirencester bus. She had rung Dr. Pemberton immediately. She had not touched anything except her shopping bag and Mr. Hargrove's shoulder. She had not noticed anyone leaving the property as she arrived. Geoffrey Hargrove stated that he had last seen his uncle the previous Sunday, when he had driven up for the day, and he had left at approximately 4 in the afternoon. He had been in Bristol all week. On Thursday evening specifically, he had been at dinner with a colleague, a Mr. David Rouse, at a restaurant called The Anchor on White Ladies Road. He had left the restaurant at 9:15 and driven directly here upon receiving the telephone call. He produced a receipt from The Anchor, time-stamped 8:47 p.m., for 2 dinners and a bottle of wine. Graves looked at the receipt for a long moment. It was very clean, very precisely timed. He put it in his folder. Mrs. Pauline Fitch from across the lane confirmed that she had seen a figure at Mr. Hargrove's door sometime between 5:30 and 6. She could not describe the person beyond medium height, dark coat. She had not thought anything of it at the time. She had gone inside when it began to drizzle. Mr. Stanley Cope, who lived at the end of the lane and walked his spaniel every evening at 6, said he had seen nothing unusual. He said this with the confidence of a man who never sees anything unusual because he is primarily watching his dog. Miss Ida Rowe, 72, retired schoolmistress, who lived in the cottage adjacent to Summerford House and shared a garden wall, said she had heard voices from the direction of Mr. Hargrove's sitting room at some point in the early evening. She could not say what time because she had been listening to the wireless and had lost track. She thought she heard raised voices at one point. Not a row, exactly, more like someone being insistent. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, as she was putting on her coat to leave, is that the grandfather clock had stopped sometime in the late afternoon. Graves looked up from his notebook. Stopped? I noticed because I can usually hear it through the garden wall when it's very quiet. I've heard it every evening for 11 years. It stops, you notice. It started again later, perhaps around 7:15, something like that. I assumed Mr. Hargrove had simply forgotten to wind it. She left. Graves sat very still for a moment, looking at his notes. Then he looked at Constable Reed. "The clock stopped," he said, and then started again. Reed nodded slowly, and the old man said the hands were wrong. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, through the sitting room wall, the grandfather clock ticked on, steady, patient, entirely indifferent to the trouble it was causing. It was Geoffrey Hargrove who mentioned Miss Marple, though he did not mean to be helpful when he did it. He had come back into the dining room to ask whether he could arrange for his uncle to be made more comfortable, and Graves had asked him, quite casually, whether his uncle had many friends in the village. "Not many," Geoffrey said. "He was a private man. There was the usual. Neighbors, the doctor. He'd been corresponding with some elderly woman in St. Mary Mead, I think. Some old family connection. He mentioned her once or twice. Marple, I think the name was. Jane Marple. He said it the way people say the names of people they consider entirely irrelevant." "She'd written to him recently, actually," Geoffrey continued. "He mentioned she might visit. I can't imagine she'd make the trip now, under the circumstances." Graves wrote the name down. He was not sure why, only that the clock had stopped and started again, and a dying man had said the hands were wrong, and none of it made a sensible pattern yet. In his experience, the people who helped patterns make sense were rarely the people you expected. Enter Miss Marple. She arrived on the Friday morning bus, not in a motor car, not in a taxi summoned from Cirencester, but on the 9:15 bus from Moreton-in-Marsh, which stopped at the Chipping Summerford lane end every weekday morning and deposited its passengers, usually no more than 2 or 3, at the wooden shelter beside the old oak tree. Miss Jane Marple stepped off with a small leather travelling bag, a knitting bag that was considerably larger than the travelling bag, and the careful, deliberate movements of a woman in her late 70s who had learned that hurrying was very rarely worth the cost. She wore a grey wool coat, a pale blue scarf, and sensible shoes that had seen a great deal of English weather and were none the worse for it. Her white hair was pinned neatly. Her blue eyes, near behind wire-rimmed spectacles, were the sort of eyes that appeared to be looking at nothing in particular, and were, in fact, looking at everything. She stood at the bus shelter for a moment, set her bags down, and opened her purse to find the small piece of paper on which she had written Edmund Hargrove's address. Her fingers were stiff this morning. They were often stiff in October, the cold settling into the joints in a way that no amount of sensible gloves entirely prevented. And it took her a moment longer than she liked to find the paper. She found it. Summerford House, Chipping Summerford. She knew the village slightly, had passed through it once or twice over the years, and had a general sense of its layout from Edmund's letters, in which he described his walks with the particular affection of a man who had found, late in life, as a place that suited him. She had received the telephone call from Dr. Pemberton at 7 that morning. He had found her number through the letters on Edmund's writing desk. Edmund had apparently kept her most recent letter in the top drawer, which she found quietly touching. The doctor had explained the situation in the careful, measured tones of a man breaking difficult news to someone he did not know, and she had listened without interrupting and asked 3 questions at the end, all of which he said later he found rather unexpected. She had packed her bag, rung for the morning bus times, and come. It was Mrs. Fitch who saw her first naturally. Miss Marple had stopped at the garden gate of Summerford House and was looking at the front of the building with an expression that Mrs. Fitch, watching from her window, I could not quite classify. Not grief, exactly. Not curiosity, exactly. Something more like the look of a person doing quiet arithmetic. Mrs. Fitch was at her own front door before Miss Marple had finished with the gate latch. "Are you here about Mr. Hargrove?" she called across the lane. Miss Marple looked up. "I am, yes. I'm an old friend, Jane Marple." Mrs. Fitch crossed the lane with the speed of someone who has been waiting all morning for something useful to happen. "Pauline Fitch, I live just there." "Dreadful business, isn't it? He's still alive, you know, but Dr. Pemberton says it's only a matter of time. The inspector from Cirencester was here half the night." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Dr. Pemberton telephoned me this morning. They're saying it might not be entirely natural causes," Mrs. Fitch said, lowering her voice by approximately 2%, which in her case still constituted a carrying tone. "Something about his wrist and the things he said before he lost consciousness. Peculiar things. So I understand." Miss Marple glanced at the front of the house again. "The clock," she said, almost to herself. Mrs. Fitch blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Nothing. Forgive me, I'm rather tired from the journey." "Would you happen to know if Inspector Graves is still on the premises?" He was. He had stayed the night in the village. Constable Reed's mother had put him up without being asked, which was the sort of thing that happened in Chipping Summerford, and he had returned to Summerford House at 8 o'clock with fresh eyes and the same unsatisfactory set of facts. He met Miss Marple in the front hallway, having been told by Mrs. Beach that a small elderly lady was at the door asking for him specifically, which he had found mildly surprising. He was more surprised when she spoke. "Inspector Graves, I'm Jane Marple. I was a friend of Edmund Hargrove's. We have corresponded for some years, and I had intended to visit next month. I came when Dr. Pemberton rang." She paused. "I wonder if I might sit down for a moment. The bus was rather drafty." He showed her into the dining room. Not the sitting room, which remained the informal center of the investigation. And Mrs. Beach, who seemed to feel that the situation called for tea regardless of what anyone officially thought, produced a pot without being asked. Miss Marple wrapped both hands around her cup and said, "Tell me about the clock." Graves looked at her. "Geoffrey Hargrove mentioned you," he said, or not answering the question yet, testing the water slightly. "Did he? I've never met him. Edmund mentioned him occasionally." She said nothing further about Geoffrey Hargrove for the moment, but something in the careful neutrality of her expression suggested she had already filed the fact of his mentioning her into a folder somewhere and labeled it. "The clock," Graves said, deciding she had earned the answer, "stopped at some point yesterday afternoon and started again around 7 in the evening. Mr. Hargrove's last coherent words referred to the hands being wrong and to someone named Eleanor having moved them." "Yes." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already half suspected. "And the hands? Are they wrong now? Is the clock showing the correct time?" Graves paused. "It appears to be. Yes." "Appears to be," she repeated gently. "Have you verified it against another timepiece in the house?" He had not. He realized, with the mild discomfort of a competent man who has missed something obvious, that he had not. They went into the sitting room together. Miss Marple moved slowly, but she moved deliberately, which was a different thing. She did not rush to the clock. She stood in the doorway first and looked at the room as a whole. The armchair where Edmund still lay, attended now by a nurse Dr. Pemberton had arranged, breathing slowly and without consciousness. The side table, the open book, the lamp, the position of the furniture, the windows. Then she walked to the fireplace and looked at the mantel clock. A small carriage clock, brass, the kind that was wound with a small key kept in the drawer below. Now she looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the grandfather clock. There was a difference of 9 minutes. The grandfather clock read 10:41. The mantel clock read 10:32. 9 minutes fast, she said quietly. Graves came to stand beside her. He looked at both clocks. Then he went to the hallway, where there was a third clock, a simple wall clock, plain white face, and checked that as well. 10:32, matching the mantel clock precisely. He came back. "The grandfather clock is running 9 minutes fast," he said. "Or," said Miss Marple, setting down her teacup on the edge of the mantelpiece and immediately thinking better of it and picking it up again, "it was set forward 9 minutes, by someone who needed 9 minutes they didn't have." The room was quiet except for the tick of the grandfather clock. now which continued with magnificent indifference, 9 minutes ahead of the truth and apparently entirely unbothered by this fact. Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment. There were 2 faint spots of color in her cheeks, the way there sometimes were when something settled into place. Not excitement exactly, more like the particular satisfaction of a pattern beginning to reveal itself. She was tired, genuinely tired, and her fingers still ached, and she had not slept especially well on the bus. But she stood in front of that clock and looked at it the way she sometimes looked at a particularly knotted skein of wool. Not with frustration, but with patience and the quiet certainty that it would come straight in the end. "Inspector," she said, "I think we ought to have a very careful conversation about Geoffrey Hargrove's receipt. Lies that tick perfectly." Inspector Graves was not, by nature, a man who took easily to being guided. He had 21 years of police work behind him, a clearance rate he was quietly proud of, and a general preference for arriving at conclusions through his own methodology rather than being walked toward them by someone else's. He was polite about it because he was a polite man, but the politeness had a firmness underneath it, the way certain handshakes do. Miss Marple understood this perfectly. She had encountered it before, in various forms, in various investigations that she had never officially been part of and had been absolutely central to. She did not push. She never pushed. She simply placed things in front of people and waited for them to look. She sat down at the dining room table, folded her hands around her teacup, and said, "The receipt from the Anchor restaurant. You mentioned it was time-stamped 8:47. "That's correct," Graves said, settling into the chair across from her. "2 dinners, a bottle of Burgundy. The time-stamp is from the card machine. Those are reliable. They run off the bank's system." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And Mr. Hargrove, Geoffrey, I mean, he said he left the restaurant at 9:15? "That's what he told me, and drove directly here upon receiving the telephone call." "Yes." "Who telephoned him?" Graves opened his notebook. Dr. Pemberton placed the call at 8:55. Geoffrey Hargrove answered on the 3rd ring. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Outside, the October wind moved through the garden, and the rose bushes that Edmund had never quite brought himself to tend scraped lightly against the sitting-room window. "So," she said, "at 8:55, Geoffrey Hargrove was in Bristol, at a restaurant, answering a telephone call." She paused. "And yet he arrived here at 11:47. That is," she did the arithmetic without apparent effort, "nearly 3 hours after the call. Bristol to Chipping. Summerford is, at most, an hour and 40 minutes on a Thursday evening. Perhaps an hour and 50 if one is cautious." Graves looked at his notebook. He had clocked the same discrepancy the previous night and had noted it without yet knowing what to do with it. Hearing it stated plainly by someone else gave it a different weight. "He could have stopped," he said, now playing the role of devil's advocate with professional thoroughness. "Petrol, composing himself. People react to distressing news differently." "Of course," said Miss Marple agreeably. "Of course he could have, and perhaps he did. I'm only observing that 3 hours is rather a long time, and that a man who presents a very precise restaurant receipt is not generally the sort of man who loses track of an hour." She said it without accusation. She said it the way one might observe that it was going to rain, or that the bread had gone slightly stale. A simple fact, offered for consideration. Graves sent Constable Reed to telephone the Anchor restaurant in Bristol at 10:30 that morning. The manager confirmed that a reservation had been made for 2, under the name Hargrove, for 8 o'clock the previous evening, and the table had been occupied. The bill had been settled by card at 8:47. The manager remembered the party only vaguely. 2 men, one of whom had done most of the talking. Reed asked whether the manager could confirm both men had been present for the entire meal. There was a pause on the line. The manager said he couldn't say for certain. It had been a busy evening. He would ask the waitress who had served that table. The waitress, when found, remembered the table because one of the gentlemen had sent back his soup. She said both men had been present when she took the order. She could not say with absolute certainty that both men had been there continuously. She had other tables to attend to. Reed wrote this down and brought it back to Graves. Graves read it, and then he took it into the dining room and laid it on the table in front of Miss Marple without comment. She read it, nodded once, said, "The colleague, Mr. David Rouse. Have you spoken with him directly?" "Not yet. I have a telephone number." "I wonder," said Miss Marple mildly, "whether Mr. Rouse might turn out to be a very obliging sort of friend." She was right, though it took until noon to establish it properly. David Rouse was reached at his office in Bristol. He confirmed, readily and without hesitation, that yes, he and Geoffrey Hargrove had dined together at the Anchor the previous evening. He confirmed the time. He confirmed the wine. He said Geoffrey had received a telephone call during dinner. The waiter had fetched him to the restaurant's telephone in the hall, which Rouse had privately found rather disruptive, though he did not say so to the inspector, and had left shortly after, very distressed. Graves asked him, carefully, at what time Geoffrey had left. Rouse said 9:15, perhaps 9:20. Graves asked whether he was certain Geoffrey had been present for the entire dinner, from 8 o'clock onward. There was a pause. Rouse said, well, Geoffrey had stepped out briefly. Around 6:30, he thought, said he needed some air. He'd been gone, 20 minutes perhaps. Maybe 25. Rouse had assumed it was nothing. Geoffrey had seemed fine when he came back. Graves thanked him and ended the call. He sat for a moment with his hand still on the telephone. 20 to 25 minutes, beginning at 6:30. Absent from the restaurant, unaccounted for, before the dinner had properly begun. The Miss Marple was knitting when he came back. She had produced the knitting from the large bag at some point during the morning, and it had progressed, he wasn't sure when, from a loose collection of blue wool to something that was beginning to resemble a sleeve. She knitted the way she thought. He was coming to understand. Continuously, without apparent urgency, and with complete attention to something other than what her hands were doing. He sat down and told her what Rouse had said. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, 6:30, 20 to 25 minutes. Yes. And Mrs. Fitch saw someone at the door of Summerford House between 5:30 and 6. She said she couldn't identify them. No, said Miss Marple. But she said medium height, dark coat. Geoffrey Hargrove is medium height. And it was October, and it was beginning to drizzle. Most people in Bristol who drive to the Cotswolds on an October evening would be wearing a dark coat. Graves was quiet. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. It's still not enough, he said. Even if he drove here, even if he was at the door. We have no evidence of what happened inside. Mr. Hargrove's cardiac episode could be entirely natural. The bruising on his wrist is suggestive, but not conclusive. The clock is 9 minutes fast, which is peculiar, but peculiar is not criminal. No, she agreed. Not yet. And his alibi, the receipt, the colleague's confirmation, the phone call answered at 8:55 in Bristol. It's strong. Even with the gap at 6:30, he was demonstrably in Bristol by 8 o'clock. Sonny couldn't have driven to Chipping Summerford and back in. He stopped. He looked at the table. In time, he finished more slowly. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Her blue eyes, behind the wire-rimmed spectacles, were entirely calm. How long, she said, does Bristol to Chipping Summerford take? An hour 40, perhaps an hour 45. So if he left Bristol at 6:30, she said, he would arrive here at 8:15, at the earliest. And the card payment at the Anchor was at 8:47. Yes. The room was very quiet. He couldn't have made it back, Graves said. The timestamps don't allow it. He'd have had to arrive here, do whatever he did, and drive back to Bristol, all between 6:30 and 8 o'clock. That's only 90 minutes, said Miss Marple. Bristol to here, something here, and Bristol back again. 90 minutes, at speed, on October roads, at dusk. She paused. Not quite impossible, but very nearly. Very nearly, Graves agreed, which means the alibi holds. Just barely, but it holds. He said it with the flat recognition of a man watching something slip just out of reach. Miss Marple set down her knitting. She looked at the wall through which, faintly but persistently, the grandfather clock could be heard, ticking in the sitting room. Unless, she said quietly, it doesn't need to hold from 6:30. Graves looked at her. The clock, she said. Edmund said the hands were wrong, that Eleanor had moved them. She folded her hands on the table. Inspector, what if the question isn't whether Geoffrey could have driven here and back in 90 minutes? What if the question is whether he needed to? The clock ticked. Graves said nothing. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. I think, she said, that tomorrow morning I would very much like to look inside that clock. What the clock remembers. She did not wait until morning. Miss Marple had said tomorrow morning in the way that one sometimes says things. Not as a firm intention, but as a placeholder, a polite way of closing a conversation that had reached the edge of what could be established without evidence. But that evening, after a light supper that Mrs. Beach insisted on preparing despite everything, and after Inspector Graves had gone to make telephone calls, and Constable Reed had settled himself in the hallway with a thermos and a paperback, Miss Marple sat in the dining room with her knitting and thought. She thought about clocks. She thought about the particular kind of person who moves clock hands, not the sort who does it carelessly, knocking something in passing and not noticing. The deliberate kind, the kind who has a reason. As she thought about Edmund, who had wound that clock every Sunday morning without fail for 11 years, who knew its voice the way you know the voice of someone who has lived in your house for a long time. Not consciously, but in your bones, so that any change in it reaches you before your mind has properly registered why. She thought about his last words. The hands are wrong. She moved them. Ask the clock. It remembers. Not he, not they. She, Eleanor. She put down her knitting at 9:30 and went to find Constable Reed. Reed was a young man, 26, with the broad, honest face of someone who had grown up in the country and retained a fundamental decency about it. He looked up from his paperback, something with a sailing ship on the cover, when Miss Marple appeared in the hallway, and got to his feet with the automatic courtesy of a person who has been properly raised. Miss Marple, can I get you anything? Mrs. Beach left biscuits in the kitchen. That's very kind. No, thank you. She looked toward the sitting room door. I wonder if I might sit with him for a little while. Edmund, just sit with him. Reed looked uncertain. Inspector Graves said the room shouldn't be. I won't touch anything, she said. I'm an old woman visiting a dying friend. I should like to sit with him. He let her in. The nurse, a stout, practical woman named Mrs. Holt, who had the reassuring competence of someone entirely untroubled by difficult situations, was in the corner chair and looked up briefly when Miss Marple entered, and then returned to her own knitting with the professional discretion of someone accustomed to deathbed visitors. Miss Marple sat in the small chair that had been brought in and positioned near the armchair where Edmund lay. He was breathing. Slowly, with long pauses that made her hold her own breath in sympathy, but breathing. His face in the lamplight looked very old and very tired, and somehow also very peaceful in the way that faces sometimes do when they have stopped trying to manage anything. She sat with him for a few minutes, just sat. There was nothing performative about it. She had known Edmund Hargrove for 30 years, through letters mostly, through 2 or 3 visits in the early days, through the particular intimacy that correspondence creates between people who write honestly to one another. She was genuinely sorry, and she would be more sorry later, when there was time for it. For now, she let herself feel it briefly and quietly, the way one feels cold air, acknowledging it, not fighting it, moving through it. Then she looked at the clock. It was, as Geoffrey had inadvertently established, an impressive piece. 7 feet tall, dark walnut with brass fittings that had been polished recently enough to still hold their shine. The painted face above the clock dial showed that pastoral scene. The cottage, the yellow sky, the small worn figures. The pendulum swung behind the glass panel in the lower section, steady and hypnotic. Miss Marple stood up slowly and moved toward it. She did not touch it immediately. She looked at it first, the way she always looked at things that mattered, thoroughly, without rushing, and without deciding in advance what she was looking for. The case was in good condition. Edmund had cared for it. There were no visible scratches on the walnut, no recent marks. The glass panel over the pendulum was clean. The clock face itself was... She leaned closer, her spectacles making the small details manageable. Original, she thought. Very old. The Roman numerals were hand-painted, slightly uneven in the way of old craftsmanship, and the hands were brass, darkened with age. She looked at the hands. They pointed to 10:43. The mantel clock, which she could see from where she stood, read 10:34. Still 9 minutes fast. She looked at the base of the clock. At the very bottom of the case, below the pendulum panel, there was a small door, the kind used for accessing the weights and the winding mechanism. She had seen similar clocks at the homes of various village acquaintances over the decades. She knew the general architecture of them. She tried the small door. It was not locked. It swung open on a hinge that moved silently, recently oiled. She crouched down. This took a moment and was not entirely comfortable, and she made a small involuntary sound that she was glad nobody was positioned to hear, and looked inside. The weights hung on their chains. The pendulum rod extended downward. Everything was as it should be, mechanically speaking, except... In the back left corner of the case, tucked behind the weight chain where it would be invisible unless one was specifically looking, was a small object. Flat, rectangular, an envelope. She did not take it out immediately. She stayed crouched for a moment, her knees registering their displeasure quite clearly, and looked at it without touching it. It was a plain white envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges in the way of paper that has been somewhere dusty, but the yellowing was old. The envelope itself did not look old. The handwriting on the front was in ink, small and precise. It said, "For whoever finds this. H.E.H. Edmund Hargrove." She stood up carefully and turned to look at Mrs. Holt. "I wonder," she said in her most pleasant and entirely unremarkable tone, "if you might fetch Constable Reed for me. I think he ought to see something." Reed came. He looked at the envelope. He looked at Miss Marple. He telephoned Inspector Graves. Graves arrived 22 minutes later, in his coat over his pajamas, as which Miss Marple noted with the private sympathy of someone who had also been pulled out of a warm evening by the insistence of facts. He looked at the envelope. He put on gloves. He opened it. Inside were two things. The first was a single sheet of notepaper, covered on both sides in Edmund Hargrove's small, careful handwriting. The second was a photograph. Graves read the letter standing up in the lamplight, while Miss Marple sat down again in the small chair because her knees had expressed a firm preference for it. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he handed it to Miss Marple. She read it twice. This is what it said. If you are reading this, then I was not able to say it properly, or I was not given the chance to say it at all. My nephew Geoffrey has been taking money from the estate for 3 years, and not a great deal at once. He is clever about that. But steadily, in the way that a careful man bleeds something slowly, so that it takes a long time to notice. I noticed 6 months ago. I said nothing. I wanted to be certain, and I wanted to decide what to do. I made a new will in September with Mr. Ashworth. Geoffrey does not know about it. Under the new will, the house and the majority of the estate go to the Hargrove Educational Trust, which I have established for the purpose. Geoffrey receives a modest sum, enough to be decent, not enough to reward what he has done. 2 weeks ago, I made the mistake of telling him I intended to change my arrangements. I did not tell him I had already done it. I thought, and this was foolish, I know it was foolish, that warning him might prompt some acknowledgement, some conversation, as he is my brother's son, and I am not without feeling for him. Instead, he became very quiet, in the way that certain people become quiet when they are deciding something. I hid this letter 3 days ago. I'm hiding it here because Jeffrey knows this house, but he does not know this clock. Nobody knows this clock the way I do. I wind it every Sunday. I know every inch of its case. If something happens to me, look at what the clock tells you. Not the time, the truth. Eleanor is the name I always use for people who cannot be trusted. Clara and I had a private name for them years ago. Eleanor, after a woman in our village who lied about small things so constantly that she could no longer tell the difference. When I say Eleanor moved the hands, I mean someone who lies moved them. I mean Jeffrey, the hands on the clock, and if they have been interfered with, will not match the other clocks in the house. The mantel clock and the hall clock are both accurate. The grandfather clock I wound last Sunday, and it was keeping perfect time. If the hands have been changed, you will be able to calculate by how much, and that will tell you something about the time that someone needed to manufacture. I'm 73 years old, and I have lived a quiet life. I am not a dramatic man, but I find that I am afraid, and that is not something I have very often been. Please be careful. He is cleverer than he appears, and he is determined. E.H. The room was very quiet. Mrs. Holt had put down her knitting. Constable Reed in the doorway was standing very still. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Inspector Graves. Then she picked up the photograph, which she had set on her knee while reading. She looked at it for a moment. It was a bank statement, or rather, a carefully typed copy of the estate's bank ledger folded neatly. The typed figures were stark and entirely legible. It showed a series of transfers, modest in individual amount, regular in interval, all from the Hargrove estate account, all to an account in the name of G.R. Hargrove. She handed that back too. 9 minutes, she said. Graves looked at her. The clock was set forward 9 minutes, she said. Edmund told us that. He said the hands were wrong. If we subtract 9 minutes from the timestamp on the restaurant receipt, 8:47, we get 8:38. She paused. And if Jeffrey left Bristol at 6:30, drove here, 1:40, and perhaps 1:45 on a Thursday evening, he would arrive at approximately 8:15. He would have at most 20 minutes here. Then he would need to drive back to Bristol in time to be at the restaurant, settled, before the card was used. The card was used at 8:47, Graves said, following it. Yes, but what if Jeffrey didn't use the card at 8:47? What if someone else did? Graves stared at her. David Rouse, Miss Marple said quietly. The obliging friend. Jeffrey drives here, does what he came to do, drives back. Meanwhile, Rouse settles the bill with Jeffrey's card, which Jeffrey has left with him for the purpose, or handed him before leaving. The machine timestamps the transaction at 8:47. Jeffrey arrives back at the restaurant and collects his card, and when the telephone call comes from Dr. Pemberton at 8:55, Jeffrey Hargrove answers it in Bristol, with a receipt and a witness and a time-stamped alibi. The clock ticked. Except, she said, that he set the grandfather clock forward 9 minutes before he left, to make Edmund's housekeeper, or anyone else, uncertain about the exact time of events here, to blur the edges slightly. And Edmund, who knew that clock better than he knew almost anything, noticed the moment he looked at it. She folded her hands in her lap. He told us, she said. He told us with almost the last words he had. The hands are wrong. He knew exactly what it meant, and he knew we would need to know it too. The photograph of the bank statement lay on the side table. The letter lay beside it. The grandfather clock ticked, 9 minutes ahead of the truth, steady and patient, and no longer keeping any secrets at all. The nephew returns. By Friday morning, the October light had turned thin and silver, the sort of light that makes every shadow look sharper and every secret feel closer to the surface. The garden at Summerford House was still damp from the night's drizzle, the rose bushes heavy-headed and dripping. Inside, the grandfather clock stood exactly where it had stood for 11 years, ticking now at its proper pace after Miss Marple herself had quietly reset the hands at first light. 10 minutes past 9, it said. And it meant it. Geoffrey Hargrove arrived at 20 past 9. He came up the path in the same dark coat Mrs. Fitch had described the evening before, though he had changed his shirt and shaved with care. His broad shoulders were set in the posture of a man bearing sorrow bravely. But his eyes, those same grey eyes his uncle had once trusted, moved too quickly. They flicked to the windows, to the door, and, for the briefest second, to the tall shape of the clock visible through the sitting-room doorway. Mrs. Beach let him in without a word. She had never liked him much, and this morning her dislike had hardened into something quiet and watchful. Inspector Graves and Miss Marple were waiting in the dining room. The table had been cleared except for two objects placed neatly in the center, the plain white envelope and the photograph of the bank statement. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, knitting bag at her feet, the blue wool now clearly forming the second sleeve of whatever garment she was making. She did not look up when Geoffrey entered. She simply continued the steady, soft click of her needles. "Mr. Hargrove," Graves said, voice level. "Please sit down." Geoffrey sat. He tried for grief, but it landed somewhere between impatience and unease. "How is he this morning?" he asked. "Still with us," Graves replied, "though Dr. Pemberton says the time is very short now." Geoffrey nodded, pressing his lips together exactly as he had the night before. Then his gaze dropped to the table and the envelope. "What's this?" Graves did not answer at once. He simply pushed the envelope across the polished wood. Geoffrey picked it up, read his uncle's handwriting on the front. "For whoever finds this. E.H." and his fingers tightened. He opened it. He read the letter in silence. Twice. When he reached the photograph of the bank statement, his face did not change much, but the color left the skin around his mouth. He laid the pages down carefully, as though they might burn him. "This is absurd," he said at last. His voice was steady enough, but the words came a fraction too fast. "My uncle was ill. He was dying. People get confused. They imagine things." Graves said nothing. He simply waited. Geoffrey turned to Miss Marple, as though she might be the more sympathetic audience. "You knew him, Miss Marple, wasn't it? You must know he was becoming forgetful. He once accused the postman of stealing roses for heaven's sake. And now this. Some wild story about me stealing money and tampering with a clock. It's nonsense." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice. She looked up, mild blue eyes behind her spectacles. "I knew Edmund very well," she said gently. "He was one of the least confused men I've ever corresponded with. And he wound that clock every Sunday morning for 11 years. He knew its voice better than most people know their own heartbeat." Geoffrey gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. "The clock, always the bloody clock. Look, I have a perfectly good alibi. I was in Bristol. I have the receipt. David Rouse was with me the whole time. The restaurant card machine doesn't lie, Inspector. You checked it yourself." "We did," Graves said. 8:47. Very convenient." "Convenient?" Geoffrey's voice rose slightly. "It's the truth. I left the restaurant at 9:15, drove straight here after the doctor rang. You can check my petrol, my phone records, anything you like." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting and regarded him with the same mild interest one might give a slightly tangled skein of wool. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "when did you last see your uncle before yesterday?" "Sunday. I told you that. I drove up for the afternoon. Left around 4. And you discussed the estate?" Geoffrey's jaw tightened. "We had a conversation, normal family talk, nothing more." Miss Marple nodded, as though that were a perfectly reasonable answer. "And you mentioned to him that you might need a little more help with your business expenses, I believe." A small silence opened in the room. Geoffrey's eyes flicked to the letter again. "I don't know what he wrote in that Fantasy, he said, but I never asked him for money. Not once. The grandfather clock in the next room struck the quarter hour. The sound rolled through the wall, deep and unhurried, perfectly on time now. Geoffrey flinched at the sound, just a fraction. Graves leaned forward. There is also the matter of the new will, drawn up in September with Mr. Ashworth in Bourton-on-the-Water, the one that leaves the bulk of the estate to the Hargrove Educational Trust. You were not informed, I understand. Geoffrey opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time, the performance of grief slipped, and something colder showed beneath it. At that exact moment, the telephone in the hallway rang. Mrs. Beach answered it. A moment later, she appeared in the dining room doorway, her face carefully blank. "It's Mr. Ashworth, the solicitor," she said. "He says it's urgent. He's been trying to reach Mr. Geoffrey Hargrove since 8 o'clock this morning." Geoffrey's hand, resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist. Graves looked at Miss Marple. She gave the smallest nod. "Put him through in here," Graves said. "Mrs." Beach brought the telephone on its long cord and set it on the table. Geoffrey stared at it as though it were a live thing that might bite. He picked up the receiver. "Geoffrey Hargrove speaking." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and perfectly audible in the quiet room. Mr. Ashworth did not waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm afraid I have to inform you that your uncle executed a new will 2 weeks ago. The document is watertight. The house, the investments, and the majority of the estate passed to the Hargrove Educational Trust. You receive a fixed sum of £10,000. I'm sorry to have to tell you this under such difficult circumstances, but your uncle was most insistent that the arrangements be final." A long, thin silence filled the dining room. Geoffrey's face had gone the color of old paper, and the receiver trembled slightly in his hand. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. The needles resumed their quiet, patient rhythm. The grandfather clock ticked on in the next room, steady, honest, and 9 minutes ahead of no one any longer. The Obliging Friend. By midday, the light in Summerford House had softened into a pale, wintry gold that slipped between the lace curtains and lay in quiet pools on the dining room table. The grandfather clock in the next room ticked on steadily now, perfectly in time with the small carriage clock on the mantel and the plain wall clock in the hallway. 9 minutes had been corrected. The lie had been exposed. Yet something in the house still felt unfinished, like a sentence that had not yet reached its full stop. Inspector Graves stood by the window with the telephone receiver in his hand. He had asked Miss Marple to remain in the room, and she had done so without comment, settled once more in her chair with the blue knitting resting in her lap. And Geoffrey Hargrove had been asked, politely but firmly, to wait in the small morning room at the back of the house under Constable Reed's quiet watch. The air felt thicker than it had an hour earlier. Graves dialed the number for David Rouse's office in Bristol. This time, he did not bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Rouse, this is Inspector Graves again. I'm afraid I need to go over yesterday evening once more, in rather more detail." There was a short pause on the line. When Rouse spoke, his voice was still helpful, still smooth, but a fraction less certain than it had been that morning. "Of course, Inspector. Anything I can do." "You stated that Geoffrey Hargrove stepped out of the restaurant around 6:30 for some air. 20 to 25 minutes, you thought. He returned, you said. And the meal continued normally." "That's right. And you are quite certain of the time he left and returned?" Another small hesitation. "Well, as certain as one can be in a busy restaurant. I didn't check my watch every minute." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, softly. She had suggested the next question to Graves only 10 minutes earlier, in the same mild tone she might have used to remark that the tea had gone cold. Graves asked it now. "Mr. Rouse, when Geoffrey returned from his little walk, did he seem different in any way? Perhaps a little out of breath? Or perhaps he asked you to do him a small favor later in the evening?" The silence that followed was longer this time. Graves could almost hear the man weighing his words. "I'm not sure what you mean by different," Rouse said carefully. "He was a bit distracted, maybe. But that's all." Graves waited. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting and spoke quietly, just loud enough for the telephone to catch her voice. "Ask him about the card, Inspector. The one Jeffrey left on the table when he went to make his telephone call later." Graves repeated the question almost word for word. Rouse gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. "Look, it was nothing. Jeffrey said he'd left his wallet in the car and asked if I wouldn't mind settling the bill when the time came. He gave me his card. Perfectly normal. Friends do that sort of thing all the time." "Even though he was sitting right there at the table?" Graves asked. Another pause. Longer. "I suppose it does sound a little odd now that you put it that way." Miss Marple set her knitting down completely. She folded her hands and spoke again, still gentle, still unhurried. "Mr. Rouse, I wonder if you would be so kind as to tell us the exact time Jeffrey received the telephone call from Dr. Pemberton. You were sitting opposite him, I believe." 9:15 or thereabouts," Rouse answered, but the confidence had drained from his voice. "He took the call at the table, looked shocked, left almost immediately afterwards." Graves thanked him, ended the call, and placed the receiver back in its cradle with deliberate care. He turned to Miss Marple. She gave a small nod, as though a piece of wool had finally slipped into place. 6:30, she said quietly. That was the only window Jeffrey needed. He drove here, spoke with his uncle, created the confusion with the clock, and drove back. Mr. Rouse, being the obliging friend he is, simply waited. So I used Jeffrey's card at 8:47 and handed it back when Jeffrey returned to the restaurant. The timestamp did the rest of the work for them, a very neat little arrangement. She picked up her knitting again, but only for a moment. The blue sleeve was almost finished now. Graves sent Constable Reed to fetch Jeffrey from the morning room. When the younger man entered, he looked more defensive than grief-stricken. His eyes went straight to the telephone, then to Miss Marple, then to the empty space on the table where the letter and photograph had been. "More questions?" he asked, trying for irritation and managing only tightness. Graves did not answer at once. He simply laid a fresh sheet of paper in front of Jeffrey. A preliminary bank report that had been delivered by a police messenger 20 minutes earlier from the Cirencester station. 6 transfers. Modest amounts. All to G.R. Hargrove. All from the estate account Edmund had trusted his nephew to help manage. Jeffrey stared at the paper. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Miss Marple's needles clicked 3 times in the quiet room. She looked up at him with the same mild, patient expression she might have given a child who had been caught with his hand in the biscuit tin. "Just one little thread left to tie up," she said softly, almost to herself. The grandfather clock in the sitting room struck the half-hour, clear and perfectly true. Outside, the October afternoon waited, patient as ever. The hands of truth. The afternoon light in Summerford House had begun to fade, turning the sitting room windows into soft rectangles of pale gold. The grandfather clock stood tall and steady in its corner, its pendulum swinging behind the glass with the quiet confidence of something that had finally been allowed to tell the truth. It ticked now in perfect time with every other clock in the house. No more 9-minute lie. No more manufactured minutes. Miss Marple rose from her chair in the dining room without hurry. She left her knitting on the table, the blue sleeve almost finished, and walked through the doorway into the sitting room where Edmund Hargrove still lay in his high-backed armchair. Dr. Pemberton's nurse, Mrs. Holt, sat in the corner, her own knitting idle in her lap. Inspector Graves followed Miss Marple. Jeffrey Hargrove came last, escorted by Constable Reed, his face set in a mask that was beginning to crack at the edges. Miss Marple stopped directly in front of the grandfather clock. She looked up at the painted face, the little cottage, the yellow sky, the worn figures, as though greeting an old friend. "Eleanor," she said softly. Jeffrey gave a short, nervous laugh. "Not this again." Miss Marple did not turn round. She kept her eyes on the clock. Many years ago, she continued in the same gentle voice, Edmund and his wife Clara had a private joke between them. In their village, there was a woman named Eleanor who told small lies so often that she eventually forgot where the truth ended and the story began. After that, whenever they met someone who could not be trusted, someone who twisted facts the way one twists a clock hand, they would simply say Eleanor to each other. A private warning. Nothing dramatic, just a name. She reached out and laid one finger lightly on the glass covering the clock face. Edmund's last words were not confused. They were precise. She moved them. He was telling us that someone he could not trust had moved the hands. He was also telling us, because he knew we would look, exactly how much time that person had needed to steal. She turned now and looked straight at Geoffrey. 9 minutes, just enough time for a man to drive back to Bristol, hand his card to an obliging friend, and settle himself at a restaurant table as though he had never left. Geoffrey's mouth opened. I only went to talk to him. That's all. Just to talk. The words slipped out before he could stop them. A small slip, but in the quiet room it sounded very loud. Graves stepped forward. Mr. Hargrove, we now have the second statement from David Rouse. He has admitted that you gave him your card and asked him to pay the bill at exactly 8:47. We also have the petrol receipt from the garage just outside Cirencester. You filled your tank at 7:52 on Thursday evening. And Dr. Pemberton's report on the bruising to your uncle's left wrist has come back, consistent with someone gripping an elderly man's arm rather firmly. Geoffrey's shoulders sagged. The mask of grief had fallen away completely now, leaving only a tired, cornered man. Miss Marple moved away from the clock and sat down in the small chair beside Edmund's armchair. She took the old man's cold hand in both of hers for a moment, as though checking that he was still with them. At that exact second, Edmund's breathing changed. It grew shallower, slower, the pauses between each breath stretching longer. Mrs. Holt rose quickly, but Miss Marple lifted one hand, calm and steady. Let him go gently, she said. He has waited long enough. The room was very still. Only the grandfather clock kept its steady rhythm. Edmund Hargrove drew one last quiet breath and did not take another. The nurse checked his pulse, then looked at Inspector Graves and gave a small, respectful nod. Miss Marple remained seated, still holding the hand that was no longer warm. After a moment, she reached out with her free hand and touched the side of the grandfather clock, just once, and the way one might touch the shoulder of a faithful old servant who had done its duty. Thank you, she whispered, so softly that only the clock could have heard. Graves turned to Geoffrey. Geoffrey Hargrove, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Edmund Hargrove. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. Geoffrey did not resist. He simply stood there, grey eyes empty, while Constable Reed placed the handcuffs on his wrists with quiet efficiency. Outside, the October evening was settling in, soft and unhurried. Inside Summerford House, the grandfather clock ticked on, honest, patient, and perfectly on time at last. Silence. After the ticking, by Saturday morning, the village of Chipping Summerford had settled into that particular quiet that follows a death in a small place. The October sky was a soft, washed-out blue, the kind that holds no threat of rain but still carries the chill of coming winter. Dew lay heavy on the rose bushes outside Summerford House, and the garden gate stood half open as though the house itself had decided it no longer needed to keep the world quite so firmly outside. Edmund Hargrove had slipped away gently the previous evening, just as the light was leaving the windows. There had been no drama, no final struggle, only a quiet breath that simply did not need to be followed by another. Dr. Pemberton had signed the certificate with the same steady hand he had used for 30 years of village births and village endings. The body had been taken away before dawn, and now the house felt strangely empty, as though the soul of the place had gone with its owner. A small knot of people had gathered at the garden gate, the same instinctive gathering that had happened 2 nights earlier, only this time the voices were lower and the mood gentler. Mrs. Pauline Fitch stood with her arms folded, her sharp eyes softer than usual. Mrs. Beach was beside her, still wearing her apron, a handkerchief twisted in her hands. Miss Ida Rowe had brought a small bunch of late chrysanthemums from her own garden and laid them carefully against the gatepost. He was a good man, Mrs. Beach said quietly. Kept himself to himself, but never turned anyone away if they needed help. Mrs. Fitch nodded. And that clock of his, always ticking, as you could hear it right through the wall on quiet nights. Now the house feels too still without it. Miss Rowe adjusted her spectacles. They say the nephew has been taken to Cirencester. Something to do with money and the clock hands. Miss Marple knew straight away, they say. The three women fell silent as the front door opened. Miss Jane Marple stepped out carrying her small leather traveling bag and the larger knitting bag. She wore the same grey wool coat and pale blue scarf she had arrived in, and her step was as careful and deliberate as ever. Inspector Graves walked beside her, carrying nothing, his long face quiet with the satisfaction of work properly finished. She paused at the gate and looked at the little group. "Thank you all," she said simply. "Edmund would have been touched to know you were here." "Mrs. Fitch found her voice first. Will you be coming back for the funeral, Miss Marple?" "I think not," Miss Marple replied. "Edmund and I said our goodbyes yesterday evening. That is enough for me." She smiled, the small, kind smile that had solved so many puzzles over the years. "Besides, the bus schedule is rather fixed." She turned to Inspector Graves. "You will let me know how the case proceeds, Inspector?" "I will," he promised. "And thank you. Without you, well, the clock might still be lying." Miss Marple gave the smallest shake of her head. "It was never the clock that lied, Inspector. Only the man who moved its hands." She said her goodbyes, accepted a small parcel of Mrs. Beach's fresh scones for the journey, and walked slowly down the lane toward the wooden bus shelter by the old oak tree. At the same shelter where she had stepped off the 9:15 bus only yesterday morning. The bus was early. She settled herself on the wooden bench, placed her bags beside her, and waited. When the bus arrived, she climbed aboard with the driver's help, chose a window seat on the left, and looked out across the fields towards Summerford House. The house looked peaceful in the morning light, honey-colored stone warm against the green of the garden. Through the sitting room window, she could just make out the tall shape of the grandfather clock. It stood silent now. The weights had been allowed to run down for the first time in 11 years. There would be time enough later for someone to wind it again, but for today, the house deserved its silence. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The bus pulled away with a gentle lurch. As it rounded the bend, she caught one last glimpse of the garden gate and the three women still standing there, watching the house as though it might speak. She thought of Edmund's last words, of the steady tick that had guided her to the truth, and of how very few people ever really listen to the small, patient things in life. A clock, a letter hidden behind weights and chains, a name whispered at the end of a life. "Dear Edmund," she murmured under her breath, "you kept your secret well, and you made sure it would be found." The bus moved on toward Morton in Marsh, carrying an old lady, a knitting bag, and the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. Behind her, Summerford House stood among its roses, silent at last. The grandfather clock had whispered the truth, and now the truth, like the clock itself, could rest.